In January of 1888, a Nebraska farmer named Thomas Whitfield woke up to find ice forming on the inside walls of his own kitchen. The temperature outside had dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero, and the wind howling across the open plains had already buried half his barn under snowdrift. Thomas Whitfield was not a wealthy man. He had no money for coal, no access to a doctor, and no way to know that this storm, later remembered as the schoolhouse blizzard, would kill more than 200 people across the Great Plains in a single night. What kept his family alive that winter wasn't luck. It was a trick passed down from his grandmother, one that cost less than a single coin and required nothing but a brick, a fire, and patience. The schoolhouse blizzard itself remains one of the strangest weather disasters in American history, precisely because of how it arrived. The morning of January 12th had actually been unusually warm for the Great Plains in winter, warm enough that many children had walked to school without heavy coats. Within a few hours, the temperature collapsed by more than 30 degrees as an Arctic front swept down from Canada, catching entire communities completely unprepared. Teachers across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and Minnesota were forced to make split-second decisions about whether to send children home into the storm or keep them trapped overnight in one-room schoolhouses with dwindling firewood. Families like the Whitfields, already isolated by miles of open prairie, had no warning at all beyond the sudden, violent drop in temperature outside their own front door. The trick itself was simple enough that most modern Americans would walk past it without a second thought. Families across the rural Midwest would heat ordinary bricks in the coals of their wood stove until they were almost too hot to touch, then wrap them in cloth or an old wool sock and place them at the foot of the bed, under a chair, or beside a sleeping child. A single brick, properly heated, could hold warmth for 6 to 8 hours. Long enough to get an entire household through the coldest stretch of the night without burning through their limited supply of firewood or coal. It sounds almost too small a thing to matter. But in a winter where temperatures fell low enough to freeze cattle standing in open fields, the difference between a warm brick and an empty hearth was often the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a physician practicing in rural Minnesota during the same era, documented something many historians still find unsettling. In her case notes from the winters of the late 1880s, she recorded a pattern she called the quiet deaths. Infants and elderly patients who simply did not survive the night, with no visible illness, no fever, no injury. Hypothermia, especially in small children and the elderly, can kill silently. The body simply slows until it stops, often without the dramatic struggle people imagine when they think of freezing to death. Dr. Hayes began recommending the heated brick method to every family she visited. Not as folk superstition, but as basic medical advice, because she had seen firsthand how often the difference between life and death in a Minnesota farmhouse came down to whether someone had thought to warm a brick before bed. Dr. Hayes was not alone in recognizing how thin the margin for survival really was on the frontier. County records from Dakota Territory during the same period show a sharp seasonal spike in deaths every winter, concentrated almost entirely among the very young and the very old, the two groups least able to generate or retain their own body heat. Coroners in small prairie towns frequently listed cause of death simply as exposure, a clinical word that did little to capture what families actually experienced. Watching a grandparent or an infant grow quieter and colder over the course of a single bad night, with no hospital for 50 miles, and no way to call for help even if one had existed. The trick did not originate in America. Long before Thomas Whitfield's grandmother ever heated a brick on the Nebraska plains, the same basic principle was already in use across rural Europe. In the cold stone farmhouses of 18th century Scotland and northern England, families used heated stones wrapped in flannel for exactly the same purpose, often called pig warmers because of their rounded shape. Scottish potters in the region of Aberdeenshire even began producing ceramic versions specifically designed for this use, shaped to fit comfortably against a sleeping body without burning the skin. When waves of European immigrants crossed the Atlantic in the mid-1800s, fleeing famine in Ireland and economic collapse in Germany and Scandinavia, they carried this knowledge with them, along with countless other small survival habits that never made it into history textbooks because they seemed too ordinary to write down. Nobody documents the things everyone already knows how to do, until the knowledge starts disappearing. That disappearance happened faster than most people realize. By the early 20th century, central heating systems began appearing in American homes, first among the wealthy in cities like Chicago and New York, then gradually spreading outward as coal furnaces and later gas heating became more affordable. The heated brick, once a household necessity, became something only the poorest rural families still relied on. And as electricity reached even remote farmhouses by the 1930s and 1940s, the practice faded almost entirely. Within 2 generations, a trick that had kept families alive through some of the deadliest winters in American history was reduced to something grandmothers mentioned in passing, if they mentioned it at all. The Rural Electrification Administration, established in 1935 under President Franklin Roosevelt, accelerated this shift dramatically across the very regions where the brick-warming trick had once been most essential. Within 15 years, the percentage of American farms with electricity jumped from roughly 10% to nearly 90%, bringing electric heaters and eventually electric blankets into homes that relied on wood stoves and warmed stones for generations. The change undeniably saved lives and improved comfort, but it also meant an entire category of inherited survival knowledge simply stopped being necessary. And knowledge that stops being necessary rarely survives being passed down for long. There is a reason this particular piece of forgotten wisdom deserves more attention than it gets today. Across the country, thousands of households still struggle to heat their homes through the coldest months, whether because of rising energy costs, power outages, or simple poverty. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has documented a steady rise in cold-related deaths during major winter storms, particularly during prolonged power outages like the one that struck Texas in February of 2021, when more than 200 people died, many from hypothermia inside homes that had simply gone cold. Entire families in Houston and Austin, cities rarely prepared for sustained freezing temperatures, found themselves in exactly the same position as the Whitfields had been in 1888, isolated, without heat, and without the inherited knowledge that might have helped them survive more comfortably until help arrived. The same basic principle that kept Thomas Whitfield's family alive in 1888, retaining heat in a dense object and releasing it slowly over hours, is the exact science behind modern emergency heat retention products that now sell for considerably more than a single brick. Companies today market vacuum-sealed heating pads, chemical hand warmers, and insulated thermal blankets using the same underlying physics that any frontier household understood instinctively, simply repackaged at a markup most 19th century farmers would have found almost comical. What makes this story worth telling isn't nostalgia for a harder time. It's the uncomfortable truth that survival knowledge, once it stops being passed down, doesn't come back easily. Thomas Whitfield's descendants still live in Nebraska today, and when researchers interviewed his great-granddaughter for a local oral history project in the 1970s, she remembered her own mother heating bricks during power outages well into the 1950s, long after most of her neighbors had already forgotten why anyone would bother. She called it the thing Grandma always did, without ever fully understanding the desperate winter that had made it necessary in the first place. That's often how forgotten ways disappear. Not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, one generation at a time, until the reason behind the habit is gone long before the habit itself. The next time the power goes out on a freezing night, the trick that once saved a Nebraska farming family from one of the deadliest blizzards in American history is still sitting there, waiting, in the bricks most people already have in their own backyard.